15 years ago, I took in a terrified 7-year-old girl who was begging outside a downtown Atlanta Greyhound bus station. Last night at her college graduation dinner, a billionaire CEO crashed our private celebration, threw the deed to a $25 million Buckhead mansion onto the dining table, and told my daughter she had finally proven she was worthy of coming home. My daughter simply smiled, picked up the heavy gold keys, and delivered a response that left the billionaire completely speechless. Before I share the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your family from toxic people who only value you when you are successful. The evening was supposed to be a flawless celebration of triumph over adversity. I had reserved the premium private dining room at the Capitol Grill in downtown Atlanta to honor my daughter Leah. At 22 years old, she had just crossed the stage as the valedictorian of Spelman College, holding a degree in computer science and the kind of brilliant future that most people only dream about. The room was perfectly warm and filled with the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low, joyful murmur of our invited guests. I stood at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, holding my glass of champagne, looking down at the beautiful, confident young woman I had the privilege of raising. I was ready to give my toast. I wanted to talk about the late nights she spent coding the moments of self-doubt we conquered together, and the immense pride I felt watching her become a pioneer in artificial intelligence. Raising Leah as a single black woman in Atlanta had never been easy. When I found her shivering at that bus stop, she was deeply traumatized and struggling with severe dyslexia. The school system wanted to leave her behind, but we spent countless hours at the kitchen table, sounding out words and turning her struggles into strengths. I worked exhausting hours as a financial forensic auditor to afford her tutoring while managing my own career. Seeing her now radiant in her graduation dress was the culmination of every sacrifice I had ever made. My sister Tara and her husband Colin were sitting near the center of the table. Colin was already murmuring to Tara about the cost of the expensive wine, complaining that I was showing off. As a white real estate broker who constantly talked about his elite connections, Colin always found a way to minimize my achievements. Tara simply nodded along, agreeing with him, as she always did, her eyes scanning the room with hidden jealousy. They had never supported my decision to adopt Leah, calling it a financial burden that would ruin my life. But I ignored them both tonight. My focus was entirely on Leah. I took a deep breath, ready to speak the words I had been practicing all week. That was when the heavy oak doors of our private room were thrown open with a violent thud. The sudden noise silenced the entire room instantly. The waitstaff who had been pouring iced water near the back wall froze in their tracks. I lowered my glass, my heart doing a sudden painful stutter as a wall of aggressive, expensive perfume flooded the space. It was Baccarat Rouge, a scent so heavy and overpowering that it completely masked the delicate aroma of our roasted steaks and buttered seafood. Walking through the doors was a woman who looked like she had stepped straight off the cover of a major financial magazine. She wore a tailored white designer suit that screamed ruthless corporate power. Flanking her were two massive men in dark security uniforms and three individuals carrying expensive leather briefcases who were clearly her legal team. It was Vivian Davenport. She was the self-made billionaire CEO of Davenport Global, one of the largest logistics empires in the country. To the world, she was a shining beacon of success, a wealthy, powerful black woman who commanded respect in every boardroom she entered. Her brand was built on the concept of excellence and overcoming boundaries. But to me, she was simply the monster who had thrown a vulnerable 7-year-old child away because that child was an inconvenience to her social climbing ambitions. Vivian did not wait for an invitation or offer an apology for the severe interruption. She marched directly to the head of the table, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She completely ignored me, acting as if I was nothing more than part of the restaurant staff hired to clear the plates. Her eyes were locked entirely on Leah, who remained perfectly still in her seat. Vivian reached into her pristine handbag and pulled out a thick embossed leather folder. The folder bore the heavy gold crest of a premier real estate agency. With a dramatic and calculated sweep of her arm, she tossed it onto the center of the table right next to Leah's untouched dinner plate. The heavy folder slid across the linen tablecloth and stopped next to a set of gleaming gold keys attached to a luxury leather keychain. "Thank you for babysitting for the past 15 years, Gwendolyn," Vivian said, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. She did not even turn her head to look at me while she spoke. Her gaze remained fiercely fixed on the young woman sitting before her. "But now that my girl has graduated as the valedictorian of Spelman College, she has finally proved that she carries the elite Davenport blood. She has shown she is excellent, and she is ready for her real life to begin." Vivian placed her perfectly manicured hands on the table, leaning toward Leah with a fake maternal smile that made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. The dining room was so quiet, you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Guests held their breath, completely paralyzed by the sudden intrusion. "That folder contains the deed to a $25 million estate in the heart of Buckhead," Vivian announced loudly, deliberately, ensuring every single person in the room could hear the staggering price tag. "The keys are right there. This is your welcome home gift, Leah. It is time for you to take your rightful place in our corporate empire. You do not belong in a cramped house with a mid-level auditor. Gwendolyn can keep her boring spreadsheets and her mediocre middle-class life. You belong in a mansion. You belong with your real mother." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Vivian stood up straight, crossing her arms and waiting for the tears of joy she was so certain would follow. She was waiting for Leah to break down and embrace the woman who had given birth to her. She expected profound gratitude. She expected her biological daughter to be completely blinded by the promise of extreme luxury and endless wealth. She expected the poor adopted girl to leap at the chance to become a billionaire heir and forget everything we had built together over the last decade and a half. I did not panic. I did not scream or demand that the restaurant security remove her from the premises. In my line of work as a financial forensic auditor, I deal with arrogant, corrupt people who think money makes them invincible every single day. I have sat across from executives who steal millions and think their bank accounts shield them from the truth. Vivian was just another fraud in an expensive suit trying to buy her way out of a moral bankruptcy. I simply took a slow sip of my champagne, placed the crystal flute gently on the table, and looked at my daughter. Leah did not flinch. She did not cry. The scared little girl who used to have severe panic attacks about being left behind was long gone. The child who struggled to read because of her severe dyslexia had transformed into a brilliant mind who wrote complex artificial intelligence algorithms. Instead of reacting emotionally, Leah slowly reached out and picked up the heavy set of keys. She turned them over in her hands, examining the expensive metal catching the light from the beautiful chandeliers above. Vivian smiled triumphantly, looking around the room to ensure everyone was witnessing her great act of charity. She genuinely believed she had already won the battle. She believed that $25 million was enough to erase 15 years of profound neglect. Then Leah set the keys back down on the table, pushing them slightly away from her plate. She picked up her cloth napkin, dabbed the corners of her mouth with absolute elegance, and looked directly into Vivian's eyes. Her voice was incredibly calm, carrying a chilling level of authority that made even Vivian's corporate lawyers shift uncomfortably on their feet. "Did it really take you 15 years to find your way here from that Greyhound bus stop?" Leah asked quietly. The words sliced through the room like a razor blade. Vivian's smug smile completely vanished, her face freezing in a mask of sudden shock. The wealthy CEO looked as if she had just been struck physically. "I hear the traffic in Atlanta is terrible." Leah continued, her tone completely unbothered. "But 15 years is a very long commute, Vivian. You threw me out because my dyslexia was an embarrassment to your perfect corporate image. You left a 7-year-old to beg for loose change because my learning disability was ruining your chances of marrying a wealthy logistics executive. Now you walk in here throwing a house at me because my face and my technology are suddenly profitable for your public relations department." Vivian opened her mouth to speak, her composure shattering rapidly, but Leah raised a single finger, stopping the billionaire in her tracks. Do not ever refer to the woman who stayed up with me every single night teaching me how to read as a babysitter," Leah said, her voice dropping to a dangerous warning whisper. "My mother is standing right there at the head of this table. You are just a biological incubator who showed up 2 decades late with a desperate bribe." I watched Vivian's face turn a dark shade of angry red. The veins in her neck became visible as her perfect facade began to crack under the weight of Leah's absolute rejection. Her own lawyers looked down at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. Vivian had barged in expecting to buy a desperate college student, but instead she was facing a brilliant, self-assured woman who could not be bought for any price. But Vivian was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully. She was a woman who was used to crushing her opposition, and she was not about to let a 22-year-old girl humiliate her in front of an audience of academic elites and family members. She took a step back, her eyes flashing with a desperate kind of anger. She prepared to launch another attack to leverage her immense wealth and power to force submission from the daughter she had discarded. Little did she know, the real trap had not even been sprung yet. The very family members who were supposed to be celebrating with me were about to show their true colors, and the situation in that private dining room was about to escalate into a legal and financial confrontation that no one saw coming. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the harsh scraping of a wooden chair against the floorboards. I watched as my brother-in-law Colin stood up, his face flushed with a desperate kind of greed. Colin had always been a man who worshipped wealth above all else as a struggling real estate broker. He spent his life chasing commissions and fawning over anyone with a net worth higher than his own. Right now, his eyes were completely glued to the leather folder containing the deed to that $25 million Buckhead estate. He walked around his side of the table, stepping closer to Vivian. He actually smoothed down his cheap blazer as if he were preparing to give a sales pitch. I sat there perfectly still, observing him. The same way I observe a frantic embezzler during a corporate audit. His body language was erratic, his breathing was shallow, and his eyes were wide with the intoxicating allure of proximity to billions. "Leah, you need to stop being so emotional and look at the reality of this situation," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet dining room. "Vivian Davenport is offering you the opportunity of a lifetime. Do you have any idea what a property in that specific gated community in Buckhead is worth? The property taxes alone cost more than what Gwen makes in 5 years. You are being ungrateful to a woman who is trying to give you the world." I shifted my gaze to my sister Tara, who was nodding vigorously beside him. Tara had spent her entire life competing with me. We grew up in the same house, but we might as well have lived on different planets. While I spent my youth studying and building a solid foundation for my career, Tara chased popularity and wealthy men. She married Colin because he promised her a life of luxury, an illusion of grandeur, that he completely failed to deliver. They were drowning in debt, leasing cars they could not afford to impress neighbors. They did not even like now, seeing an actual billionaire standing in our private dining room. Tara saw a chance to align herself with real power. Tara stood up and joined her husband, crossing her arms as she glared at me. "Gwen, you need to stop being so selfish," Tara announced, her voice deliberately loud so that the university deans and esteemed professors at the table would hear every single word. "You have always tried to control Leah and keep her trapped in your mediocre life. Vivian is a billionaire. She can give Leah the kind of connections and elite status that you could never dream of providing. You are just an accountant." Vivian turned to look at Colin and Tara, a slow, triumphant smile returning to her face. She realized she had found allies in my own family. The billionaire adjusted her designer jacket, clearly pleased that her wealth was doing exactly what it was designed to do, corrupting the people around her. She thrived on turning families against each other, using her checkbook as a weapon of mass division. Colin felt emboldened by Vivian looking at him. He turned his attention directly to me, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "Look at you, Gwen," he sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. You are sitting there in an off-the-rack suit that you probably bought on sale 5 years ago. You work in a dreary office crunching numbers for a living, while the real players are out making moves. How can you sit there and try to deny this girl a chance to be part of the Davenport empire? You should be thanking Vivian on your hands and knees for stepping in to fix this girl's future. The audacity of a man who constantly borrowed money from me, criticizing my wardrobe and my career, was almost comical. My suit was not off the rack. It was custom-tailored, but I did not feel the need to explain that to a man whose credit score was lower than his cholesterol. I simply let him continue talking, letting him dig his grave deeper with every word in my profession. Silence is the greatest tool you can deploy against a narcissist. Tara noticed that the guests were whispering, and she decided to escalate her attack. She wanted to destroy my credibility completely in front of Leah and the academic elite of Atlanta. She wanted to tear down the respectful reputation I had spent decades building. Tara leaned forward, resting her hands on the table, and raised her voice even louder, making sure her words bounced off the wood-paneled walls. "Let us tell the truth about why you really adopted her, Gwen," Tara shouted, her face twisted with a bitter jealousy that had festered for 15 long years. "You did not take her in out of the goodness of your heart. You adopted a disabled kid because you wanted those monthly government welfare checks. You wanted the tax breaks and the pity from everyone in our community. You used this girl to make yourself look like some kind of saint while secretly cashing in on her trauma." Gasps erupted around the dining room. Several professors from the college covered their mouths in shock at the vile accusation. The dean of the computer science department looked physically ill. The waitstaff stopped moving entirely, freezing with trays of food still balanced in their hands. It was a horrendous lie, a calculated fabrication designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. The government stipends for foster care barely covered the cost of Leah's specialized dyslexia tutoring, let alone the immense financial sacrifice it took to put her through a premier institution like Spelman College without a single dollar of student debt. Tara knew this perfectly well. But truth does not matter to people who are desperate for the approval of the wealthy. Vivian looked absolutely delighted by this revelation. She turned to Leah with a look of fake maternal sympathy, playing the role of the tragic mother who had just uncovered a horrible conspiracy. "You see, my sweet girl," Vivian crooned, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "You were just a paycheck to her, a way to subsidize her pathetic middle-class existence. I am here to rescue you from this fraud. I am here to give you the lifestyle you truly deserve. You do not owe this woman anything." Everyone in the room looked at me, waiting for my reaction. The air was so thick with tension, it felt hard to breathe. The lavish spread of food in front of us was entirely forgotten. They expected me to jump up from my chair and scream. They expected me to throw my drink in my sister's face or aggressively defend my honor against these baseless slanders. They expected the stereotypical angry scene that plays out on reality television, a screaming match that would validate Vivian's belief that we were beneath her. I gave them absolutely nothing of the sort. In the rigorous world of financial forensic auditing, you learn very quickly that the person who loses their temper is the person who loses control of the entire negotiation. Panic is for the guilty. Anger is a luxury for the weak. I knew exactly who I was. The late nights I had spent holding Leah when she cried out from night terrors, the countless weekends spent reviewing flashcards, the deep, unshakable bond we had forged through sheer perseverance. And more importantly, I knew exactly who my daughter was. I slowly picked up my wine glass, the fine crystal feeling cool and solid against my calm fingers. I brought it to my lips and took a measured, deliberate sip of my Cabernet Sauvignon. The wine was rich and complex, and I took a moment to appreciate the vintage. Closing my eyes briefly, then I set the glass back down on the table with a soft clink that resonated clearly in the quiet room. I picked up my crisp white linen napkin and gently dabbed the corners of my mouth, moving with an unhurried grace that seemed to infuriate my sister even more. I looked across the table at Leah. My beautiful, brilliant daughter was watching me intently, despite the vicious lies being hurled across the room by her own aunt and uncle. Leah did not look broken or distressed. Her hands were not shaking. She was watching my face, waiting for my cue. We had spent 15 years communicating without words, a silent language built on deep mutual trust and understanding that no amount of money could ever replicate or destroy. I gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. My eyes told her everything she needed to know. Let them talk. Let the social climbers put on their little show. Let them expose their true character to a room full of highly influential people who would never forget this display of raw greed. Give them enough rope to hang themselves, and they will do the heavy lifting for you. Leah understood immediately. A subtle shift occurred in her posture. She relaxed her shoulders, leaning back in her chair with an air of absolute regality. She crossed her arms, resting them casually over her graduation gown, and simply watched Tara and Colin as if they were performing a mildly amusing stage play meant solely for her entertainment. Colin completely mistook our calm silence for submission. He thought his harsh words had finally put me in my place, breaking my spirit. He turned back to Vivian with a wide, sycophantic smile, eager to secure his position in her good graces before the dust could even settle. Mrs. Davenport, Colin said, his voice practically trembling with eager desperation. As a premier real estate broker here in Atlanta, I am very familiar with the Buckhead estate you purchased. It is a magnificent property, truly a crown jewel of the city. If you need any assistance managing the transition or perhaps acquiring additional investment properties in the area to expand your portfolio, my firm would be absolutely honored to represent you. We know exactly how to handle high net worth clients with the total discretion you require. It was a shameless, transparent attempt to secure a billionaire client in the middle of a deeply personal family dispute. Colin was willing to sell out his sister-in-law and humiliate his niece for the slight chance of earning a commission check from Vivian Davenport. The greed was radiating from him in visible waves. Tara was right beside him, trying to network her way into Vivian's exclusive social circle. We have always tried to tell Leah that she was destined for much greater things. Tara chimed in, smiling warmly at the woman who had abandoned her own flesh and blood to the streets. We tried to show her that Gwen's restrictive, boring lifestyle was holding her back from her true potential. We would love to help her transition into your beautiful world, Vivian. We know exactly how to handle the social expectations of the Atlanta elite, and we could mentor Leah on how to behave like a Davenport. Vivian smiled graciously at them, accepting their frantic praise as her royal due. She believed she had completely conquered the room. She had my own family bowing at her expensive heels. She had the deed to a massive mansion sitting on the table, and she believed she had me backed into a miserable corner of humiliation and total defeat. Her eyes swept over me with a look of absolute pity and victory. I watched the three of them revel in their imagined victory. It was truly a fascinating psychological study of human greed and short-sightedness. They were so blinded by the allure of money and social status that they completely forgot to ask themselves a very basic, very crucial question. Why would a notoriously ruthless logistics CEO, who was famous for her cold calculations, suddenly track down the disabled child she discarded 15 years ago? Billionaires do not give away $25 million mansions out of sudden maternal guilt or a miraculous change of heart. They make strategic investments. They calculate massive returns. They only move when there is a significant profit to be made. Tara and Colin were far too foolish to see the trap, but my mind was already 10 steps ahead, analyzing the hidden liabilities and dark motives behind Vivian's sudden, overwhelming generosity. I sat in my chair perfectly composed, projecting the quiet, unshakable power of a woman who knows she holds all the winning cards in her hand. The real game had not even started yet, and they were completely unprepared for the devastation that was about to follow. Vivian sensed the quiet shift in the room. She knew my calm silence was dangerous, so she decided to pivot her strategy entirely. The ruthless corporate shark vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced seamlessly by the tragic repentant mother. She reached up and dramatically wiped a single perfectly timed tear from the corner of her eye, being careful not to smudge her expensive designer makeup. She leaned across the mahogany table, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Oh, my sweet Leah," she whispered, her tone engineered to sound utterly heartbroken. "I was so young and terrified when I left you at that station. I was a single woman trying to build an empire in a world that wanted to see me fail. Every single day of my life has been filled with agonizing regret. I just wanted to come back when I could give you everything you ever desired." The professors at the table shifted, uncomfortably drawn into the masterful performance. Tara let out a dramatic sigh of sympathy, clutching Colin's arm, as if they were witnessing a beautiful family reunion on a daytime talk show. Colin nodded along, his eyes still glued to the keys of the $25 million mansion. Vivian signaled to the lead attorney standing behind her. He stepped forward, opening his expensive leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, cream-colored paper. He placed the stack gently on the table, sliding it directly in front of Leah. He then uncapped a gleaming silver Mont Blanc pen and laid it carefully beside the papers. "This is just a standard trust fund acceptance form," Vivian said, her voice soft and coaxing. "It simply transfers the deed of the Buckhead estate into your name and grants you immediate access to the offshore accounts. Just sign on the dotted line, my darling, and we can put the past behind us. We can finally be a family." Colin leaned forward, his eyes practically bulging out of his head. "Just sign it, Leah," he hissed urgently. "Do not let your mother ruin this for you. Just pick up the pen." Leah did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on Vivian's face, piercing through the fake tears and the rehearsed apologies. She did not even glance at the silver pen. Instead, she looked at me. In the corporate world, they rely on emotion to rush bad decisions. They use urgency and the illusion of a massive windfall to bypass basic due diligence. But I am a financial forensic auditor. I have spent my entire career hunting down the lies hidden in the fine print of shell companies and offshore accounts. I do not do emotion. I do data. I calmly reached across the table and pulled the thick stack of documents toward myself. "Gwen! What are you doing?" Tara shrieked, her voice echoing in the dining room. "Stop being so bitter and let the girl sign her future away." I ignored my sister entirely. I adjusted my posture and began to flip through the heavy pages. Vivian's lead attorney stiffened his hand, twitching slightly toward the documents as if he wanted to snatch them back. "Mom, these are private legal documents between my client and her daughter," he said, his voice tight with sudden panic. "Leah is 22 years old, and I am her legally recognized adoptive mother and financial advisor," I replied without looking up from the paper. "My daughter does not sign anything until I have reviewed it. And since Vivian just offered this in front of 50 witnesses, it is now a matter of public record." When I pulled that thick stack of cream-colored paper toward me, I felt the familiar thrill of an audit. The heavy pages were filled with standard distraction clauses, provisions about property maintenance, tax escrow accounts, and homeowner association fees, all designed to lull the reader into a false sense of security. Corporate attorneys use volume as a weapon. They bury the knife under mountains of boring, irrelevant text, hoping exhaustion will lead to a quick signature. But my entire career was built on finding the knife. I took my time turning the pages deliberately, making Vivian wait, letting the silence stretch out and fray her nerves. The paper was thick, the kind that costs a small fortune just to print, filled with signatures from junior partners who probably spent 80 hours drafting this exact trap. I could see the exact architecture of their deception, the way they layered the clauses to obscure the true cost of the gift. They assumed a black woman from a middle-class neighborhood would be too intimidated by the legalese to read the fine print. They assumed my motherly pride would blind my professional skepticism. My eyes scanned the document rapidly, skipping the beautiful promises and heading straight for the dense, unreadable text at the back. I bypassed the first 20 pages. Corporate lawyers always put the most appealing terms at the front: the deed transfer, the trust fund allocations, the beautiful promises of generational wealth. It was all there designed to dazzle an amateur into signing before they reached the end. But I was not an amateur. Vivian's fake tears immediately dried up. The soft maternal expression vanished, replaced by a rigid mask of cold calculation. Her jaw clenched as she watched my eyes scan the tiny paragraphs at the back of the binding. There it was, buried deep within the legalese on page 47, under a section misleadingly titled Standard Reciprocal Considerations. The sheer evil of it almost took my breath away. It was not just a simple transfer clause, it was a perpetual enslavement contract. It stated that any future technological developments, modifications, or derivative works created by the recipient would automatically become the sole property of Davenport Global. Vivian was not just trying to steal Leah's current invention. She was trying to chain my daughter's brilliant mind to her sinking company for the rest of her natural life. She wanted to own Leah's brain. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound cut through the tension in the room like a clear bell. It was a laugh of pure professional amusement at the sheer audacity of the attempted theft. Colin slammed his hand on the table. "What is so funny, Gwen?" he demanded angrily. "You are ruining the biggest moment of her life." I looked up from the document, locking eyes with Vivian. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the paper, the sound sharp and crisp. "Let us read. Clause 4.b together, shall we?" I announced, my voice clear and authoritative, projecting to every single person in the room. Vivian's lead attorney took a step backward, pulling nervously at his collar. By accepting this trust and the associated properties, I read aloud, making sure my diction was flawless. The recipient, Leah Hayes, unconditionally agrees to transfer, assign, and surrender all current and future intellectual property rights, patents, copyrights, and proprietary algorithms developed, authored, or registered by the recipient in perpetuity to Davenport Global Incorporated. A heavy, stunned silence crashed down over the private dining room. The dean of the computer science department gasped aloud, suddenly understanding exactly what was happening. The professors at the table, individuals who spent their lives nurturing young, brilliant minds, were visibly repulsed. The dean, a man who had personally mentored Leah for 4 years, slammed his fist onto the table. "That is intellectual indentured servitude," he called out, his voice booming across the room with academic authority. "You should be ashamed of yourself, Mrs. Davenport. You came into a house of learning to steal from a student." Vivian's lawyers looked down at their expensive leather shoes, suddenly very interested in the floorboards. They were accustomed to bullying small business owners and terrifying minor competitors, but they had never been exposed so thoroughly and publicly in front of Atlanta's academic and social elite. Attempting to defraud a valedictorian in front of 50 highly educated witnesses was not just a legal failure, it was career suicide. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table toward the billionaire, who was now trembling with suppressed rage. "This is not a welcome home gift, Vivian," I said, my voice steady and lethal. "This is a corporate acquisition disguised as a family reunion. A $25 million house is a very generous present for a college graduate, but it is an absolute insult of a purchase price for a supply chain optimization artificial intelligence algorithm that is projected to be worth billions." Tara and Colin looked back and forth between me and Vivian, completely lost. Their tiny minds could not process the magnitude of the corporate espionage unfolding right in front of them. "What algorithm?" Tara asked, her voice weak. "What is she talking about, Vivian?" Vivian did not answer. She glared at me, her chest heaving as her perfect plan disintegrated into dust. I turned to my sister, who was still gripping Colin's arm. "Let me explain it in terms simple enough for a failed real estate broker to understand," I said, keeping my eyes on Colin. Leah did not just graduate at the top of her class last month. She successfully patented a revolutionary machine learning algorithm designed to predict and optimize global shipping routes in real time. It is the holy grail of the logistics industry. I turned my attention back to the billionaire standing frozen at the head of the table. Davenport Global has been bleeding money for 3 quarters. I continued reciting the financial realities I had uncovered during my independent research. Your supply chain infrastructure is outdated, your fuel costs are astronomical, and your automated sorting systems are failing. You are losing major contracts to younger, faster competitors. You did not come here today because you missed the daughter you threw away like trash. You came here because you realized the disabled child you abandoned grew up to invent the exact technology that could save your dying empire. Vivian's bodyguards shifted uncomfortably, looking at their boss, who was now completely exposed in front of the Atlanta elite. The academic dignitaries at the table were whispering furiously to one another, documenting every second of the spectacular downfall of Atlanta's most famous logistics mogul. You tried to exploit her youth and her assumed desperation for a mother's love, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady cadence that commanded absolute attention. You thought you could dazzle a 22-year-old girl with a shiny set of house keys and trick her into signing away her life's work. You thought we were just poor, ignorant people who would bow down at the sight of a designer suit. Vivian placed her hands flat on the table, leaning toward me with a look of pure hatred. She dropped the entire maternal act. Her voice was a harsh, venomous hiss. "She owes me," she snarled, ignoring the shocked gasps of the guests. "I gave her life. I brought her into this world. She would be nothing without my genetics. That technology belongs to my bloodline." The sheer delusion in her statement was breathtaking. She actually believed that a biological contribution entitled her to the fruits of Leah's grueling labor and brilliant mind. I smiled, a cold, calculated smile that matched the ice in her eyes. "Genetics do not teach a child how to code, Vivian," I replied smoothly. "Genetics do not dry her tears when she is bullied at school. Genetics do not stay up until 3 in the morning, helping her debug a complex neural network. I did that. I raised her. I built her confidence. I funded her education. You provided nothing but trauma, and now you want to harvest her genius to save your sinking ship." It was intellectual, indentured servitude, carefully masked by the illusion of Black excellence and generational wealth. Vivian was not offering a hand up. She was tossing a golden net over my daughter's future, hoping the shine would blind us to the ropes. Vivian realized she was losing the narrative completely. She stood up straight, attempting to salvage whatever scraps of her dignity remained. "You are making a massive mistake, Gwendolyn," she declared, her voice echoing harshly in the room. "You and this ungrateful girl are turning down ultimate power. You will never see an offer like this again. You will go back to your pathetic little house and your boring spreadsheets, and you will regret the day you decided to cross me." I could have made her a queen. "A queen of a failing enterprise," I countered smoothly, my voice never rising above a conversational volume. "You do not seem to understand, Vivian. We do not need your wealth because Leah has already generated her own. We do not need your mansion because Leah can buy 10 of them by the end of the fiscal quarter. You came here to hunt what you thought was a naive child, but you walked into a room with a woman who has outgrown you in every conceivable metric." Vivian's jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might shatter. She grabbed the thick leather folder from the table, snatching it back with a violent jerk. The gold keys to the Buckhead mansion clattered against the wood left behind like a forgotten prop from a cancelled stage play. "This is not over," Vivian threatened, her voice shaking with raw, unfiltered rage. "My company has a team of the best litigators in the country. I will bury you in court, Gwendolyn. I will sue for intellectual property rights based on familial obligation. I will drain every cent you have ever saved." I simply smiled. The threat was empty, and we both knew it. There is no court in the United States that awards patent rights based on abandoned biological ties. I was ready to watch her storm out of the room. But the real climax of the evening was just beginning to bubble to the surface. The poison pill in the contract had been exposed, but the collateral damage was about to claim its first victim. Colin finally understood the situation, But his reaction was not one of outrage on behalf of his niece. Instead, his face turned the color of wet ash. He stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a serving cart, the glasses clattering sharply against each other. His breathing became ragged, and he clawed at his chest, as if he was having a sudden heart attack. Tara grabbed his arm, her voice panicked. "Colin, what is wrong with you? What is happening?" I watched Colin's hyperventilation with clinical detachment. His panic was not the panic of a man who had just seen his niece almost get scammed. It was the deeply personal terror of a man who had just realized his own financial ruin was imminent. His eyes darted from the unsigned contract on the table to Vivian's furious face, and then down to his own trembling hands. Tara was shaking him now, demanding to know what was wrong. But Colin could barely speak. He just kept muttering the same words over and over again like a broken record player. The stock, the stock. He slowly turned to look at his wife, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the lever to be pulled. The realization of his actions had finally caught up with him, crushing the breath from his lungs. And the truth he was about to reveal would shatter whatever remained of their superficial marriage. Tara gripped Colin's shoulders, her long acrylic nails digging into the cheap fabric of his blazer. "Colin, what are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising in a shrill crescendo of panic. "What stock, Colin? Answer me right now." Colin could barely focus his eyes on her. He looked past Tara, staring blankly at the empty space on the table where the contract had been sitting just moments before. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The realization of his catastrophic mistake was acting like a physical weight crushing his ribs. "I bought it!" He gasped out the words barely audible over the murmurs of the stunned dinner guests. "I bought all of it, Tara. Everything we had." Tara shook him violently, her perfectly curated image of Atlanta high society elegance completely shattering in front of the academic elite. "Bought what, Colin? What did you buy?" Colin swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat dripping down his temple. "Davenport Global," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I bought call options on Davenport Global stock. Thousands of them. I used the savings account, Tara. I used the equity line on the house. I even liquidated the kids' college funds yesterday afternoon." A collective gasp echoed across the private dining room. The dean of the computer science department actually took a step back, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at the magnitude of the financial suicide unfolding before his eyes. Tara froze, her hands dropping from Colin's shoulders as if she had just been electrocuted. Her face went slack, her mouth opening and closing as her brain desperately tried to process the words her husband had just spoken. "You did what Tara asked," her voice dropping to a dangerous, trembling whisper. "You spent our money. All our money." Colin nodded frantically, trying to justify the monumental stupidity of his actions. "I thought I was making the smartest move of my life, Tara," he pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. "Listen to me. I saw the invitation to this dinner. I saw that Vivian Davenport was coming in person. I am a broker, Tara. I know how these things work. A billionaire CEO does not show up to a random college graduation dinner in Atlanta unless she is closing a massive deal. I did my research. I saw that Davenport Global was struggling and their stock was tanking. But then I realized she must be coming here to acquire Leah's tech. I knew it. I knew she was going to buy the algorithm and announce it on Monday morning. The stock would have skyrocketed, Tara. It would have gone up 300%. We would have been multimillionaires by next week. We could have finally paid off the leased cars and the credit cards. We could have been real players in this city." Tara let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. She stumbled backward, bumping into a chair, her hands flying up to clutch her perfectly styled hair. "You gambled everything we own on a guess!" she shrieked, the sound tearing through the elegant atmosphere of the Capitol Grill. "You took my children's future and you betted on a corporate merger that you knew absolutely nothing about. We are ruined, Colin. We have a mortgage we cannot afford. We have debts you swore you were paying off. How could you be so stupid? Colin turned toward Vivian, his eyes wide with a pathetic pleading desperation. Mrs. Davenport, he begged, taking a step toward the billionaire. Please, you have to fix this. Just buy the algorithm anyway. Pay whatever they want. Please, Mrs. Davenport, you cannot let your company fail. If your stock crashes on Monday morning, the margin calls will trigger, and my broker will liquidate everything. I will owe hundreds of thousands of dollars that I do not have. Please, you have to close this deal. Vivian looked at Colin with an expression of such profound disgust that it actually made me smile. The logistics billionaire took a step back, brushing her designer suit as if Colin's desperation might physically contaminate her. Do not speak to me, you pathetic little man. Vivian hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venom. You expect me to care about your pathetic gambling debts. You are nothing but a bottom-feeding parasite trying to scavenge scraps off my table. You thought you could ride my coattails to wealth, and now you are begging me to save you from your own staggering incompetence. Get out of my sight before I have my security team throw you through the window. Colin shrank back, his entire body trembling. He looked around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face, but found absolutely nothing but judgment and revulsion. The wealthy academics and university board members were looking at him like he was a diseased rat that had wandered into a five-star kitchen. I sat in my chair observing the absolute destruction of my sister and her husband with the calm clinical detachment of a financial auditor. This was the inevitable result of living a life driven entirely by greed and the desperate need to appear wealthy. Colin and Tara had spent their entire marriage looking down on my steady, reliable career. They had mocked my modest home and my practical budget. They had laughed at the long hours I spent reading financial reports, calling me a boring number cruncher who would never understand how to build real wealth. Yet here was Colin, the self-proclaimed real estate genius, throwing his entire life into a highly illegal and profoundly stupid financial maneuver. Colin, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic noise of Tara's sobbing. I want you to stop crying about your lost savings for just one moment and think very carefully about what you have just confessed to doing in a room full of highly educated witnesses. Colin blinked at me through his tears, his face a mask of miserable confusion. What are you talking about, Gwen? He choked out. I just lost my house. I just lost everything. What else is there to think about? I picked up my wine glass, gently swirling the dark red liquid as I looked at him. I am talking about the federal law. Colin, I said, my tone light but razor sharp. I am an auditor. I deal with corporate compliance every single day of my life. You just admitted to leveraging non-public material information regarding a potential corporate acquisition to purchase call options on a publicly traded company. You used family connections to anticipate a confidential business deal, and you executed trades based on that inside knowledge to secure a personal profit. The color that had barely returned to Colin's face vanished instantly. He stopped crying. The room grew so quiet you could hear the distant traffic outside the restaurant windows. That is insider trading. Colin, I continued, laying out the reality of his situation with precise, merciless clarity. It is a direct violation of the Securities Exchange Act. It is a federal crime. And because you used margin accounts and leveraged your home equity to cross state lines with those trades, you have likely triggered wire fraud statutes as well. You are not just looking at bankruptcy, Colin. You are looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Tara let out a blood-curdling scream. She launched herself at Colin, hitting his chest with her fists. You are going to jail, she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysterical panic. You are going to jail, and you are taking us down with you. You absolute idiot. You ruined my life. You ruined my image. How am I supposed to show my face at the country club? How am I supposed to look at my friends? You made us criminals, Colin. Colin did not even try to defend himself against her blows. He just stood there absorbing the physical and verbal assault, his eyes glazed over with the paralyzing terror of a man who suddenly realizes his life is completely and permanently over. The illusion of the wealthy, successful broker was dead. All that remained was a broke, desperate criminal facing federal prosecution. Vivian watched the marital breakdown with a cold sneer of superiority. She adjusted her white designer jacket, refusing to let the chaos around her ruin her regal posture. "This is exactly why I left this pathetic family," she announced, her voice loud and commanding, trying to wrestle control of the room back into her hands. "Look at you all, screaming and crying over pennies like common street trash. You are all weak. You are small-minded people who will never understand what it takes to build an empire. I offer you a path to ultimate power, and you dissolve into a pathetic puddle of middle-class misery." She turned her gaze back to Leah, who was still sitting calmly in her graduation gown, watching the spectacle with quiet, intelligent eyes. Vivian pointed a sharp, manicured finger at my daughter. "And you," she sneered, "you think you have won something today because you figured out a little puzzle in a contract. You think you are so smart because you built a computer program. You are nothing without the Davenport name. You are just an arrogant little girl playing a game with adults. You will fail out there in the real world, and when you do not come crawling back to me begging for a second chance." Leah did not flinch. She did not look away. She slowly picked up the silver Montblanc pen that Vivian's lawyer had left on the table. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the heavy, expensive weight of the metal. She looked at Vivian with an expression of such profound pity that it actually made the billionaire take a hesitant step backward. "You keep talking about your empire," Vivian, Leah said, her voice smooth and melodic, cutting through the tension with effortless grace. "You keep bragging about your ultimate power and your brilliant corporate strategies. But the truth is, you are terrified. I can see it in your eyes. You are sweating under that expensive suit because you know exactly what is coming on Monday morning, and you know there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it." Vivian's jaw clenched. "Do not presume to know anything about my business, little girl," she warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Oh, I know everything about your business," Leah replied, setting the silver pen down gently next to her empty plate. "I know that Davenport Global relies on an antiquated routing system that was built in the late 90s. I know that your fleet burns 30% more fuel than your competitors because your dispatch algorithms cannot calculate dynamic weather patterns or real-time traffic congestion. I also know that the Department of Transportation audited your emissions protocols last month and found you in massive violation of federal environmental standards. You are facing a $1.2 billion fine, Vivian. Your board of directors is panicking. Your major institutional investors are preparing to dump your stock. You are bleeding cash and your company is days away from a total catastrophic collapse." Vivian's eyes widened. The confident mask finally slipped, completely revealing the desperate, frightened executive underneath. "How do you know that?" she demanded, her voice shaking slightly. "Those audit results are strictly confidential. They have not been released to the public, because I did not just build a computer program," Vivian, Leah said, leaning forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. "I built the only supply chain optimization artificial intelligence in the world capable of retrofitting your entire legacy fleet. My algorithm can reduce your fuel consumption by 40% and bring you back into federal compliance within 30 days. I am holding the only life jacket that can keep Davenport Global from drowning in its own incompetence. That is why you tracked me down. That is why you came here today, throwing mansions and trust funds at me. You did not want to save me, Vivian. You needed me to save you." Tara and Colin had stopped arguing, completely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of the corporate warfare happening at their dinner table. Colin was shaking visibly, realizing that his insider trading was based on a company that was fundamentally broken from the inside out. "You are a very smart girl," Vivian said, trying desperately to regain her footing, trying to pivot back to a negotiation. "You see the value of what we can do together. So let us stop playing these little games. Sign the contract, Leah. Name your price. If 25 million is not enough, I will double it. I will give you $50 million and a seat on my executive board. We can rule the logistics industry together." mother and daughter. A dynasty of black excellence. Leah smiled a genuine, beautiful smile that illuminated her face. It was the smile of a young woman who knew her exact worth in a world that constantly tried to devalue her. You are offering me $50 million for a technology that you desperately need to survive. Leah asked, her tone dripping with polite amusement. Yes, Vivian said eagerly, taking a step forward, believing she had finally found the right number to buy her daughter's loyalty. 50 million, cash, transferred to your accounts by tomorrow morning. Leah let out a soft melodic laugh. She reached into the inner pocket of her graduation gown and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. It was much thinner than Vivian's massive stack of contracts, but it carried 100 times the weight. Leah placed it on the table, opening it carefully. That is a very generous offer, Leah said, her eyes sparkling with absolute triumph. But my mother, Gwen, taught me never to accept the first bid, especially when the buyer is desperate. And more importantly, my mother taught me to always know my market value. Leah slid a single sheet of paper from the black folder and pushed it across the polished wood toward Vivian. I am afraid your offer is a little too low and a little too late, Leah said, her voice ringing with the quiet, indisputable authority of a true, self-made billionaire. The technology you are trying to steal is no longer available on the open market. I closed the deal yesterday afternoon. Vivian stared at the single sheet of paper, her eyes darting across the printed text. Her face drained of all color, matching the crisp white of her designer suit. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. No, Vivian whispered, stepping back from the table as if the paper had physically burned her. No, this is impossible. They cannot do this. I looked at the paper, knowing exactly what it was because Leah had called me, crying tears of joy the moment she signed it. It was an exclusive licensing and acquisition contract, Leah announced, ensuring every single person in the room heard the final devastating blow. I sold the exclusive global rights to my supply chain optimization algorithm to Amazon. The purchase price was $500 million in cash, plus a 2% equity stake in their advanced robotics division. They are integrating my technology into their global prime network as we speak. Your biggest competitor now owns the only algorithm that could have saved you. Davenport Global is officially dead. Vivian, you are finished. The absolute silence that followed Leah's declaration was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my entire career. Vivian Davenport, the untouchable logistics billionaire, stood completely frozen at the head of the mahogany table. Her perfectly tailored white designer suit suddenly looked less like armor and more like a surrender flag. Her hands, which had been gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were white, began to tremble with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Leah leaned forward and gracefully picked up the heavy silver Montblanc pen that Vivian's lawyer had placed on the table earlier. With a calm, deliberate motion, Leah uncapped the pen. She pressed the silver tip to the first page of the trust fund acceptance contract that Vivian had tried to use as a trap. Leah drew a slow, thick black line diagonally across the entire page, crossing out the deceptive words and the empty promises. She capped the pen and placed it gently on top of the ruined document. You brought a pen to a sword fight, Vivian, Leah said, her voice a soft melodic whisper that carried effortlessly across the quiet room. You thought you could buy my life for $25 million, but you forgot to factor in the reality that my life is already worth $500 million. You do not own me. You never did. Colin let out a sound that resembled a dying animal. He dropped to his knees right there on the expensive carpet of the Capitol Grill. His hands were tangled in his own hair, pulling at the roots as the crushing weight of his financial suicide finally broke his mind. The Amazon acquisition meant that Davenport Global stock was not just going to drop, it was going to completely crater. His highly leveraged call options were going to become toxic debt the moment the stock market opened on Monday morning. His broker would demand hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover the margins. Tara stood above him, staring at her husband with a mixture of absolute disgust and pure terror. She realized that her days of parading around Atlanta in leased luxury cars and designer knockoffs were permanently over. She was going to be the wife of a bankrupt felon. The billionaire finally snapped. The polished facade of black excellence and corporate royalty disintegrated into dust. Vivian let out a screech of pure, unadulterated rage that made the crystal glasses vibrate on the table. She lunged forward, her manicured hands scrambling across the smooth wood to snatch the leather folder containing the deed to the Buckhead mansion and the gold keys. She clutched the folder to her chest, breathing heavily, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. "You get nothing!" Vivian screamed, her voice raw and completely unhinged. "You hear me, Gwendolyn? You get absolutely nothing. I am taking this house back. I will burn it to the ground before I let you or this ungrateful little brat step foot inside it. You think you have won because you signed a deal with Amazon? I am still a billionaire. I have armies of lawyers. I will tie that patent up in litigation for decades. I will bleed you dry in legal fees until you are back to living in a tiny, miserable apartment. This house is mine, and you are both going to pay for humiliating me." I watched her throw her tantrum with the absolute calm of a predator, watching a mouse struggle in a trap. I took one final sip of my wine, enjoying the rich, dark flavor of the Cabernet. I set the glass down, smoothed the lapels of my modest, sensible suit, and stood up from my chair. The scrape of the wood against the floor drew the attention of every single person in the room. The university deans, the waitstaff, my weeping sister, and the hyperventilating broker all turned to look at me. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, simple leather card holder. I extracted a single, thick business card and tossed it casually onto the center of the table. It landed right next to the contract Leah had just crossed out. "I think I forgot to introduce my full professional title earlier this evening," I said, my voice projecting with the cool, detached authority of a woman holding an executioner's axe. "You keep referring to me as a mid-level accountant, Vivian. You keep insulting my career and my modest lifestyle because you measure a person's worth by the price tag on their clothing. But let me clarify exactly what I do for a living. I am Gwendolyn Hayes, the managing partner of Hayes Forensic Auditing. And as of last Tuesday, I am the special lead investigator officially appointed by the United States Securities and Exchange Commission to audit the financial irregularities of Davenport Global." The lead attorney standing behind Vivian physically recoiled. The color drained from his face as his eyes locked onto the business card lying on the table. In the corporate legal world, the SEC is the ultimate grim reaper. I have spent the last 7 days tracking the offshore shell companies you used to hide your failing logistics metrics. I continued, stepping out from behind my chair and walking slowly down the length of the table toward her. "I have traced the illicit funds you siphoned from your corporate accounts to maintain your billionaire lifestyle while your company secretly bled to death. And more importantly, Vivian, I tracked the exact origin of the funds you used to purchase that $25 million Buckhead estate you are clutching to your chest." Vivian looked down at the leather folder in her arms, as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. She looked back at me, her eyes wide with a new, unfamiliar emotion. It was pure, unadulterated terror. "You bought that house using diverted shareholder dividends," I said, stopping just a few feet away from her. "It was a textbook case of money laundering designed to hide capital before your board of directors realized your company was insolvent. And because I submitted my preliminary findings to a federal judge late last night, the United States government took immediate action. At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, federal agents moved in and officially froze the Buckhead estate. That mansion is currently a seized asset under federal jurisdiction. You cannot gift a property that the government is preparing to confiscate, Vivian. The deed you are holding is nothing more than worthless paper." The sharp staccato clicks of brass latches snapping shut cut through the tension like gunshots. The 3 corporate lawyers who had marched into the private dining room like conquering generals were now moving with the panicked, frantic energy of rats abandoning a sinking galleon. Their faces, previously set in masks of bored superiority, were now chalk white. In the high-stakes world of corporate litigation, there is a very clear, very bright line between aggressive negotiation and federal obstruction. Gwendolyn Hayes had just announced herself as the lead investigator for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. By brandishing that business card, she had fundamentally altered the reality of every single person in the room. The lawyers knew instantly that if they remained at that table, if they continued to represent a woman who was actively attempting to execute fraudulent contracts while under active federal investigation for money laundering and insider trading, they would not just lose their law licenses, they would be indicted as co-conspirators. The lead attorney, a man who had sneered at me mere moments before, did not even look at his billionaire client. He shoved his expensive gold-plated pen into his pocket and grabbed his leather briefcase. "We are leaving," he announced, his voice tight and breathless. His two associates did not need to be told twice. They were already moving toward the heavy oak doors, their heads bowed, desperate to put as much physical distance as possible between themselves and Vivian Davenport. Vivian spun around, her eyes wide with shock and sudden blinding panic. "Where do you think you are going?" she demanded, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of its usual polished command. "I am paying you $3,000 an hour. You do not leave until I dismiss you. Get back here right now and figure out a way to break this Amazon contract." The lead attorney paused with his hand on the brass doorknob. He turned his head slightly, but he refused to make eye contact with the woman who had paid his firm millions over the last decade. "Ms. Davenport," he said, his tone flat and utterly professional, stripped of any loyalty or warmth. "As of this exact moment, you are the subject of an active federal criminal investigation. Our firm was retained for civil trust matters, not federal fraud defense. We are legally and ethically terminating our representation effective immediately. Any further communication must be directed through the proper channels. Do not contact my office." He opened the door and the three of them practically sprinted out into the main dining room, leaving Vivian standing completely alone. The physical manifestation of her power, the wall of legal intimidation she had relied on to crush her enemies, simply evaporated into thin air. I watched the sheer terror finally bloom on Vivian's face. For 15 years, she had believed that money made her invincible. She believed that wealth could insulate her from the consequences of her own horrific choices. She thought she could throw away a child, let that child be raised by someone else, and then swoop back in to harvest the profits whenever she pleased. But the harsh, unforgiving light of federal justice was now shining directly on her, and there was nowhere left to hide. Vivian looked down at the mahogany table. The $25 million deed lay there useless and frozen. The contract meant to enslave her daughter was crossed out in thick black ink, and the single sheet of paper confirming the Amazon acquisition sat there like a death warrant for her entire logistics empire. She had lost everything in the span of 20 minutes. She turned her furious, desperate gaze toward Leah. "You did this to me," Vivian hissed, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. "You planned this with her. You set me up. You destroyed your own mother's legacy just to prove a point. You are a monster!" Leah slowly stood up from her chair. The movement was fluid and graceful, a stark contrast to Vivian's erratic, jerking motions. Leah picked up her graduation cap, the tassels swaying gently. She looked at the woman who had given birth to her, not with anger, but with an overwhelming, absolute indifference that was far more devastating than any shouted insult. "I did not destroy your legacy," Vivian, Leah said softly, her voice carrying the quiet strength of a woman who had faced her demons and emerged victorious. "You destroyed it the day you decided that greed was more important than integrity. I simply built a better algorithm and I sold it to a better company. That is not a setup. That is just good business. And as for being a monster," she paused, a small, sad smile touching her lips, "I think we both know that the only monster in this room is the one who leaves a 7-year-old girl at a bus stop because she cannot read fast enough." The collective gasp from the academic elites and family members in the room was audible. The sheer brutality of that truth, spoken so calmly and clearly, stripped away the last remaining shreds of the false narrative Vivian had constructed around her life. The grand illusion of the self-made flawless icon of black excellence was completely obliterated. She was exposed as a ruthless, shallow opportunist who had sacrificed her own flesh and blood for the illusion of status. I stepped forward, signaling to the restaurant manager who was hovering anxiously near the doorway with two massive security guards. The manager, a seasoned professional who catered exclusively to Atlanta's upper crust, understood the assignment immediately. He stepped into the room, flanked by the guards. "Ms. Davenport," the manager said, his tone impeccably polite but utterly firm, "I am afraid I must ask you to leave the premises immediately. Your presence is causing a significant disruption to our other guests, and this private dining room was reserved exclusively under Ms. Hayes' name." Vivian stared at the manager as if he had just slapped her across the face. "Do you know who I am?" she shrieked, the last vestiges of her control snapping completely. "I am Vivian Davenport. I am a billionaire. I can buy this pathetic restaurant and fire every single one of you. I will not be thrown out like some common criminal." "Actually," I interjected smoothly, picking up my wine glass and taking a relaxed sip, "as the lead investigator assigned to your case, I can assure you that your financial assets are currently inaccessible. You cannot buy this restaurant, Vivian. Judging by the alert I just received from my team regarding your frozen personal accounts, you currently cannot even afford to pay for the valet parking." A ripple of laughter echoed from the back of the room. The professors and deans, individuals who had dedicated their lives to genuine excellence and quiet dignity, could no longer contain their amusement at the spectacular downfall of this arrogant, abusive woman. It was a mocking, dismissive sound that cut deeper than any knife. The Atlanta elite, the very people Vivian had spent her life trying to impress and dominate, were now laughing at her complete destruction. The security guards stepped closer, their large frames imposing. "Mrs. Davenport," one of them said, his deep voice leaving no room for argument, "we can do this quietly or we can do this loudly, but you are leaving this room right now." Vivian looked at the guards, then at the laughing academics, and finally at Leah and me. The realization that she was entirely powerless, that she was surrounded by enemies she had created herself, finally crushed her spirit. The fight drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell of a woman facing imminent federal prosecution. She grabbed her designer handbag, the expensive leather looking absurdly trivial against the backdrop of her ruined life. She turned and walked toward the door. Her shoulders slumped, the arrogant strut replaced by the heavy, dragging footsteps of the defeated. As she passed Colin and Tara, who were still crumpled on the floor, sobbing over their lost savings, Vivian did not even glance down. She walked out of the private dining room, flanked by the security guards, stepping out into the main restaurant. The doors remained open, and we watched the final act of the tragedy unfold. The main dining room of the Capitol Grill was packed with influential Atlanta figures, politicians, CEOs, and local celebrities. They all stopped eating, their forks suspended in midair as they watched the mighty Vivian Davenport being frog-marched out the front doors by restaurant security. The whispers started immediately spreading like wildfire from table to table as smartphones were pulled out to document the unbelievable scene. The collapse of the Davenport empire was no longer a secret confined to our private room. It was public knowledge, broadcast live to the very society she had fought so ruthlessly to control. I turned away from the door, the satisfaction settling deep in my chest. The threat had been neutralized, the enemy vanquished, and the future secured. I looked at Leah, my brilliant, beautiful daughter who was adjusting the tassel on her graduation cap. She caught my eye and smiled, a bright, unburdened expression that filled the entire room with light. The storm was over, and the real celebration could finally begin. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind the restaurant manager, effectively sealing Vivian Davenport's fate and removing her toxic presence from our lives forever. I turned away from the doorway, feeling a profound sense of lightness expanding in my chest. The academic dignitaries at the long table were already returning to their seats, buzzing with hushed conversations about the spectacular downfall they had just witnessed. But the ugly reality of the evening was not completely resolved just yet. At my feet, kneeling on the expensive imported rug of the private dining room, were my sister Tara and her husband Colin. The arrogant real estate broker who had strutted into this room wearing a cheap blazer and a superiority complex was now a crumpled, sobbing mess. Colin understood the financial markets just enough to know exactly how thoroughly he had destroyed his own life. He knew that when you buy call options on margin, you are essentially borrowing money from a brokerage to make a highly leveraged bet. If the stock crashes, the broker issues a margin call demanding immediate cash to cover the devastating losses. Colin did not have the cash. He had used the equity in their suburban home. He had drained their checking accounts, and he had stolen his own children's college funds. Colin scrambled forward on his knees, his hands reaching out to grab the fabric of my custom-tailored trousers. "Gwen," he pleaded, his voice raw and ragged tearing through his throat. "Gwen, you have to listen to me. You do not understand what I did. The margin calls are going to trigger the second. The opening bell rings on Monday morning. The broker is going to seize the house. They are going to take the cars. We are going to be out on the street by Tuesday. I am going to lose my real estate license. Gwen, please." Tara crawled over to join him. Her perfectly applied designer makeup completely washed away by torrents of desperate, terrified tears, she looked up at me, her eyes wide with the realization that her entire fake socialite identity was permanently dead. "Gwen, please," she wailed, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her impending poverty. "We are sisters, Gwen. We share the same blood. You cannot let them throw my husband in a federal penitentiary who will take care of my children. You have to fix this. You are the lead investigator for the SEC. You have the power to erase his name from the trading logs. You can just make the record of his options disappear before the federal prosecutors see it. You can save us." I looked down at my sister and felt absolutely nothing. There was no warmth, no pity, and no familial obligation left in my heart for 15 years. Tara had mocked my life choices. She had looked down on my sensible budget, my modest home, and the quiet dignity of my profession. Just 20 minutes ago, she had stood in front of this very room and loudly accused me of adopting a disabled child solely to steal government welfare checks. She had actively tried to publicly humiliate me and hand my brilliant daughter over to a corporate monster, all for the slight chance to rub shoulders with a billionaire. She wanted to destroy my life for her own social gain. I stepped back from them, making sure their desperate, grasping hands could not touch my clothes or stain my shoes. I looked at Colin, who was staring up at me with pathetic, watery eyes, waiting for a lifeline that was never going to come. "I am sorry, Colin," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and entirely devoid of any emotion, "but I think you have fundamentally misunderstood my capabilities. I am just a boring auditor with my face in the books. I crunch numbers for a living. While the real players are out making moves, is that not exactly what you said to me earlier tonight?" Colin choked on a violent sob, shaking his head frantically back and forth. "No, Gwen, I was stupid. I was just trying to impress her. I did not mean it. Please, you are the smartest person I know. You can hack the system. You can hide the trades. Nobody has to know, Gwen. We are family. I cannot hide a federal felony." "Colin," I replied, my tone dropping to a cold clinical register, and even if I could, I absolutely would not risk my impeccable reputation, my career, and my own freedom to save a man who just tried to sell my daughter to a corporate parasite. You gambled your entire livelihood on an illegal insider trade because you thought you were smarter than the system you wanted, the quick money, the easy wealth, the unearned status. You played a high-stakes game of corporate roulette, and you lost everything. That is the reality of the market, Colin. There are no bailouts for greedy men who make stupid bets. Tara let out a sound of pure agony, grabbing at the air near my ankles. "Gwen, I am begging you," she screamed completely, ignoring the disgusted looks from the university deans who were watching the entire pathetic display unfold. "I am your sister. We grew up together, you know. I cannot survive being poor. I cannot go back to living in a tiny apartment and shopping at discount stores. My friends will laugh at me. The country club will revoke our membership. My life will be over. Please, Gwen. I will do anything. I will get on my hands and knees and scrub your floors. Just save us from this. Leah walked over and stood right beside me, her graduation gown brushing against my leg. She looked down at the aunt and uncle who had spent her entire childhood treating her like an unwanted burden, like a charity case that was holding their perfect family back. You should have thought about your precious country club membership before you decided to help Vivian Davenport try to steal my life, Leah said, her voice ringing with the quiet, indisputable authority of a woman who had just sold an algorithm for $500 million. You stood right there and told a room full of highly educated people that my mother only adopted me for government checks. You tried to strip away 15 years of unconditional maternal love just to impress a woman who did not even know your names. You tried to sell me out for social status. And as for being poor, Aunt Tara, Leah continued, her eyes locking onto Tara's terrified face, maybe it will build your character. My mother and I survived on very little when I was young, but we had integrity, we had love, and we had each other. You have absolutely nothing because you built your entire life on a foundation of fake designer bags and leased cars. You are about to find out exactly who you are when the money runs out, and I suggest you start practicing your apologies for your children because they are the ones who are going to suffer the most for your incredible stupidity. The brutal honesty of Leah's words hit Tara like a physical blow. She collapsed onto the floor, burying her face in her hands, sobbing so hard her entire body shook violently. Colin was hyperventilating, his eyes darting around the room as his mind fractured under the terrifying reality of federal prison. I looked down at Colin, watching his complete and total destruction. "Why do you not go beg your billionaire friend for help, Colin?" I suggested, my voice echoing with pure, unfiltered irony. "You were just offering to be her premier real estate broker. You were practically kissing her expensive white shoes. I am sure Vivian Davenport would love to write you a personal check to cover your margin calls." Oh, wait. I paused, pretending to remember a minor technical detail. Her personal and corporate assets are currently frozen by the federal government, and she is likely going to be indicted by Wednesday morning. It seems your elite connections are not going to pan out. After all, you backed the wrong horse, Colin. I turned my back on them. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. The familial bond that Tara had tried to weaponize in her defense had been severed permanently by her own toxic actions. You cannot poison the well for 15 years and then beg for a drink of water when your own house catches on fire. I reached over to the mahogany table and picked up my small, elegant clutch purse. Leah adjusted the gold tassel on her graduation cap, her face radiant and completely unbothered by the sobbing relatives groveling on the carpet. She looked like a queen stepping over the ruins of a conquered enemy. The dean of the computer science department gave Leah a warm, respectful smile as we prepared to leave. "We will see you on campus next week, Mrs. Hayes," he said, clearly, choosing to ignore the pathetic, sobbing couple on the floor. "We have a lot of exciting endowments to discuss about that robotics lab." Leah smiled back, thanking him gracefully for his time and his mentorship. Before turning to walk out with me, I placed my hand gently on the small of my daughter's, back guiding her toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. Tara screamed my name one last time, a desperate raw sound of total abandonment. "Gwen, do not walk away from us. Gwen, please, we are family. Gwen, please." I did not stop walking. I did not turn around. I pushed the heavy doors open and we stepped out into the softly lit corridor of the Capitol Grill, leaving the traitors to drown in the shallow, miserable puddle of their own catastrophic greed. The air outside the private room felt instantly lighter, cleaner, and entirely free of their toxic, suffocating presence. We had won the war, and we were never looking back. The next morning arrived with a profound and beautiful stillness that seemed to settle over our modest brick house like a warm, protective blanket. I woke up just before sunrise, my internal clock functioning with the same precise discipline that governed my professional life as an auditor. For the first time in 15 years, I opened my eyes and realized that the heavy, suffocating shadow of Vivian Davenport was completely gone. The invisible threat that had lingered in the back of my mind since the day I found a terrified 7-year-old girl at a Greyhound bus station had been permanently erased by the events of the previous night. I pushed back the simple cotton sheets and stepped out of bed, my bare feet resting on the cool hardwood floor. I did not need a $25 million mansion in Buckhead to feel a sense of absolute peace. I walked into our master bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, looking at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not just a boring accountant with her face in the books as my brother-in-law had so foolishly claimed. She was a protector, a mother and a federal investigator who had just dismantled a corrupt corporate empire without ever raising her voice. I put on a comfortable pair of gray sweatpants and a worn vintage college t-shirt, embracing the quiet comfort of our suburban life. I padded softly down the carpeted stairs and walked into our small but immaculate kitchen. The early morning sunlight was just beginning to filter through the blinds, casting long golden shadows across the granite countertops. I reached for my favorite bag of dark roast coffee beans, the rich, earthy aroma grounding me instantly. I measured the grounds with practiced precision, pouring fresh water into the coffee maker and pressing the button to start the brew cycle. The soft bubbling sound of the machine was the only noise in the entire house. As I stood there waiting for the coffee to brew, my mind briefly drifted to Colin and Tara. I wondered if they had even managed to sleep at all, or if they had spent the entire night pacing the floors of their heavily mortgaged home, frantically calculating exactly how many days they had left before the banks and the federal authorities came to collect their dues. They had chosen greed over family. They had chosen proximity to a toxic billionaire over basic human decency, and now they were locked in a prison of their own making. I felt no guilt about walking away from them at the restaurant. You cannot save people who are determined to drown themselves in their own shallow ambitions. I heard the soft, familiar creak of the floorboards at the top of the stairs. A moment later, Leah walked into the kitchen. She was wearing oversized sweatpants and a faded Spelman College hoodie, her hair pulled up into a messy bun on top of her head. She looked so incredibly young, and yet she carried an aura of quiet, unshakable power that commanded absolute respect. The valedictorian, the tech genius, the newly minted self-made billionaire looked completely relaxed. There was no anxiety in her posture, no lingering trauma from the confrontation with the woman who had birthed and abandoned her. "Good morning, Mom," she said, her voice thick with sleep but laced with a deep, genuine warmth. "Good morning, sweetheart," I replied, reaching into the cupboard to pull out 2 ceramic mugs. I poured the steaming dark coffee, handing one mug to my daughter. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, closing her eyes, and taking a deep, appreciative breath of the steam. We stood side by side, leaning against the kitchen counter, sipping our coffee, in a comfortable, harmonious silence. We did not need to constantly fill the air with empty chatter or performative displays of wealth like the people we had left behind at the Capitol Grill. Our bond was built on years of shared struggles, late-night study sessions, and unconditional trust. After a few minutes, I reached across the counter and picked up the television remote. I pressed the power button, turning on the small flat screen mounted on the kitchen wall. I switched the channel to the premier national financial news network, knowing exactly what programming would be dominating the morning broadcast. We did not have to wait long. The screen illuminated with a massive glaring red banner flashing across the bottom ticker: breaking news, federal raid at Davenport Global Headquarters. The news anchor, a typically stoic man in a sharp suit, looked genuinely grave as he delivered the morning headlines. The screen split into 2 panels showing live aerial helicopter footage of the massive logistics empire in downtown Atlanta. The pristine corporate plaza that Vivian had spent hundreds of millions of dollars to construct was currently swarming with dozens of dark federal vehicles. FBI agents and SEC investigators, wearing tactical windbreakers with bold yellow lettering, were streaming in and out of the towering glass building. They were carrying tall stacks of cardboard evidence boxes, hard drives, and confiscated server racks. The camera zoomed in to show crowds of bewildered corporate employees standing outside on the sidewalks, clutching their briefcases and coffees, completely shocked as their corporate sanctuary was systematically dismantled piece by piece. We are receiving confirmed reports that the Securities and Exchange Commission has initiated a massive, coordinated asset freeze targeting both the personal and corporate accounts of CEO Vivian Davenport. The anchor announced, his voice serious and urgent, filling our quiet kitchen with the sound of federal justice. Reliable sources within the Department of Transportation have confirmed that Davenport Global is facing a catastrophic $1.2 billion fine for systemic environmental and safety violations dating back over 5 years. Furthermore, an emergency federal injunction has been filed regarding massive financial irregularities and potential money laundering involving a network of offshore shell companies. The television screen shifted to show a live graphic of the stock market ticker. Davenport Global stock, which had already been quietly bleeding value for months, was now caught in a sheer vertical freefall. The opening bell of the market had rung just 30 minutes ago, and the stock had already lost 85% of its total value. The anchor reported that trading had been halted automatically 3 separate times due to extreme volatility, but the financial bloodbath was completely unstoppable. Institutional investors and major hedge funds were dumping their shares in a blind panic, trying to escape the sinking ship before the stock reached absolute zero. But the true vindication came a moment later, when the anchor touched his earpiece, receiving a real-time update from the newsroom. In related news, the anchor continued, his expression tightening. Federal investigators are also looking into highly irregular options trading activity that occurred just prior to this morning's raid. Sources suggest an aggressive sweeping crackdown on suspected insider trading linked to local Atlanta real estate brokers who are personally connected to the Davenport family. Authorities believe these individuals attempted to leverage massive call options based on non-public material information regarding a failed corporate acquisition. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the dark roasted liquid warm my throat. Colin was finished. The federal government was already tracing his desperate, greedy trades. The SEC surveillance algorithms would flag his heavily leveraged margin accounts, instantly leading the federal agents right to his manicured suburban front door. Tara would lose the sprawling house, the leased luxury cars, and every single ounce of the superficial social standing she had ever cared about. They had tried to sell their souls to a billionaire for a piece of the pie, and they had swallowed pure lethal poison instead. Vivian Davenport will likely face federal indictment before the end of the week, the anchor concluded as the broadcast showed archival footage of the CEO arriving at a gala, juxtaposed with live footage of her personal luxury vehicles being loaded onto government tow trucks. The self-made billionaire who built an empire on the illusion of black excellence is now watching her entire legacy evaporate in real time. I pressed the power button on the remote and the screen went black. The sudden quiet in the kitchen was incredibly beautiful. The monster who had thrown my daughter away because she thought a learning disability was a corporate liability was gone. Her empire was reduced to federal evidence boxes and frozen bank accounts. She would likely spend the rest of her natural life navigating federal courtrooms and minimum security prisons. Leah set her coffee mug down on the granite counter. She did not look gloating or malicious. She just looked completely unbothered, moving on to the practical matters of the day. She walked over to our small wooden kitchen table where a neat stack of crisp, clean legal documents was waiting. These were not deceptive traps hidden in microscopic fine print by manipulative corporate lawyers. These were the official incorporation papers for her new artificial intelligence technology firm. She sat down at the table, pulling a simple black ink pen from the pocket of her sweatpants. There were no flashing cameras, no aggressive legal teams trying to force her hand, and no fake tears of maternal regret. There was just a brilliant young woman quietly taking absolute control of her own destiny. She signed the first page, her signature smooth, fluid, and confident. The Amazon acquisition had legally cleared all regulatory hurdles, and the funds had officially transferred into her secure encrypted accounts at 6:00 this morning. Leah was no longer a brilliant college student fighting for academic recognition. She was a self-made tech billionaire stepping effortlessly into the exact power vacuum that Vivian Davenport had just left behind. She flipped to the next page, signing the articles of organization. She had decided to name the company Apex Logistics Solutions, deliberately refusing to use the Davenport name or even our own last name. She wanted the technology to stand on its own merit, entirely divorced from the toxic legacy of her biological mother and the complicated history of our family. The algorithm was hers, and the empire she was building would be rooted in true innovation, not exploitation. I watched her sign the final page, formalizing the birth of her new tech empire. She did not need a $25 million mansion in an elite gated community to validate her worth. She had the intellect to build her own city if she wanted to. I am transferring $5 million into a separate trust account today, Leah said without looking up from the paperwork, her tone incredibly casual for someone moving millions of dollars before breakfast. I am setting up a foundation to provide intensive tutoring and educational resources for children in the Atlanta foster care system who have been diagnosed with severe learning disabilities. I want to make sure no other kid with dyslexia ever gets told they are broken or worthless just because they learn differently. I smiled, feeling a profound swell of pride that had absolutely nothing to do with her massive bank account and everything to do with the content of her character. That is a perfect first initiative, I said, walking over to the table and looking down at the freshly signed documents. You are going to change a lot of lives, Leah. You are going to give those kids the exact tools they need to realize their own brilliance. She capped her pen and looked up at me, her eyes bright clear and entirely free of shadows. We already changed mine, Mom, she replied softly. That is the only return on investment that ever really mattered to me. I placed my hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. The long, exhausting war was over. The traitors in our family had been permanently exposed. The wicked billionaire had been rightfully punished, and the brilliant little girl from the bus station had officially conquered the world. We did not need to celebrate with expensive champagne or gloat over the smoking ruins of Vivian Davenport. We just needed to get to work. I have an audit review with the SEC regional director at noon, I said, picking up my coffee mug and heading toward the hallway to get ready for the day. And you have a massive transition meeting with the engineering team at Amazon. We should probably get dressed. Leah laughed, a light, joyful sound that filled the house, gathering her documents into a neat, precise stack. You are right, she said, standing up from the table and stretching her arms. We have an empire to build. We walked out of the kitchen together, leaving the ghosts of the past behind us permanently. The future was ours, and it was absolutely spotless. 6 months passed with the quiet, steady rhythm of pure, unrelenting progress. Atlanta had moved on from the spectacular collapse of Vivian Davenport, but the shockwaves of that morning still echoed through the financial districts. The city had watched a fake empire crumble to dust, and in its place, they were witnessing the quiet rise of a true visionary. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in late October. I parked my reliable Honda in the dedicated spot behind a beautifully restored historic brick building in the heart of downtown Atlanta. This was the official headquarters of the Hayes Foundation for Innovative Learning. Leah had purchased the building in cash, completely renovating the interior to create a state-of-the-art educational sanctuary for foster children and kids diagnosed with severe learning disabilities. I walked through the front doors, and the atmosphere immediately struck me. There were no sterile corporate logos and no intimidating security checkpoints designed to make people feel small. The walls were painted in warm, calming colors, and the halls buzzed with the sound of actual learning. I passed by a glass-walled classroom where a group of 12-year-old kids were building basic robotics. These were children who had been written off by the public school system, children who had been told they were broken because their brains processed letters differently. Now they were learning how to write code from industry professionals whose salaries were fully funded by my daughter's trust. I made my way up the open staircase to the executive floor. Leah's office was not a massive, intimidating fortress like Vivian's had been. It was a bright, collaborative space filled with comfortable chairs, whiteboards covered in complex equations, and large windows that let the natural light pour in. Leah was sitting at her desk reviewing a stack of grant applications. She wore a simple black turtleneck and dark jeans, her hair in neat braids. She did not look like a tech billionaire. She just looked like a woman who was entirely focused on her purpose. She looked up when I entered, and that familiar bright smile illuminated her face. "Right on time, Mom," she said, setting her tablet down and gesturing to the comfortable leather chair opposite her desk. "I just finished the quarterly budget projections. I know you want to audit them before we finalize the next round of community grants." I sat down, placing my briefcase on the floor. "I will always audit your books, Leah," I replied smoothly. "But I already know they are flawless. You inherited my obsession with clean data." She laughed, leaning back in her chair. We sat there in comfortable silence for a moment, just looking out the window at the Atlanta skyline. The contrast between this peaceful office and the toxic battleground of the Capitol Grill 6 months ago was profound. There was no anxiety here, no performative posturing, and no fear of sudden abandonment. We had completely excised the infection from our lives, and the resulting health of our environment was undeniable. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the financial reports she had securely transmitted to my firm the night before. Running my fingers over the printed spreadsheets, I felt a deep professional satisfaction. The numbers were a perfect reflection of Leah's integrity. There were no hidden offshore accounts, no aggressive tax avoidance schemes, and no exploited laborers. Every dollar was accounted for and effectively deployed to maximize human potential rather than corporate greed. I looked across the desk at my daughter, observing the quiet confidence that radiated from her posture. "I heard that the federal prosecutors formally denied the plea deal for Colin this morning," I said, keeping my voice conversational and entirely detached. "The SEC is making an absolute example out of him. He is looking at a mandatory minimum sentence for the wire fraud charges, and his real estate license was permanently revoked last month." Leah listened without a single trace of pity. Tara had to move the kids into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment out in the furthest suburbs. I continued updating her on the collateral damage of our relatives' greed. The bank foreclosed on their house and repossessed all of their leased luxury vehicles. She is currently working the reception desk at a local dental clinic to make ends meet, and I heard she has been trying to sell her designer handbags online just to cover her grocery bills. Leah did not gloat or smile maliciously at the news. She just absorbed the information with the calm stoicism of a chess player observing a finished board. "They built a house of cards and they got angry when the wind blew," she said quietly. "I do not feel sorry for them, Mom. They made their choices every single day for 15 years. They chose to worship people who despised them, and they paid the ultimate price for their lack of basic integrity. They wanted to be part of the elite so badly that they sacrificed their own family members to get there. Now they get to experience exactly what it feels like to be discarded by the society they sacrificed everything for." "And Vivian?" I asked, knowing that the federal trial date was rapidly approaching. Leah's expression remained completely neutral, unbothered by the mention of her biological mother. "Her legal team is dragging out the discovery process, but it is completely useless," Leah replied, resting her hands on the desk. "Amazon fully integrated my algorithm into their global logistics network last week, and their shipping efficiency has already improved by 30%. Davenport Global officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy yesterday afternoon." The government is currently auctioning off her personal assets to pay the massive Department of Transportation fines. The Buckhead mansion went on the open market this morning at a significantly reduced price. The poetic justice of it all was absolute. The $25 million house that Vivian had tried to use as a gilded cage to trap my daughter was now being sold off by the federal government to pay for Vivian's own corporate incompetence. She had tried to buy Leah's brilliant mind with stolen money, and now she had absolutely nothing left to her name. Her fake empire had been entirely dismantled by the very child she had thrown away. Vivian spent her entire life obsessed with the concept of black excellence, I said, resting my arms on the leather chair. She used that phrase like a heavy weapon to justify her cruelty and her ruthless business practices. She thought that accumulating massive wealth and stepping on other people to reach the top was the absolute definition of success. She thought that being excellent meant being entirely untouchable. Leah nodded her eyes, reflecting a deep, mature understanding of the world that most people never achieve in a lifetime. She thought power was about how many people you could force to bow down to you. Leah said, her voice steady and clear. But she was completely wrong. Black excellence is not about hoarding resources or leaving your community behind to sit in an isolated ivory tower. It is not about throwing away a child because they do not fit your perfect aesthetic image, or because they have a learning disability that inconveniences your social climbing. Leah looked out the window down at the courtyard where several kids from the foundation were eating lunch and laughing together under the shade of a large oak tree. True excellence is about what you build for the people who come after you. Leah continued, her gaze soft as she watched the children. It is about taking the resources you have and creating a strong, reliable ladder for someone else to climb. It is about looking at a kid who is struggling to read and seeing a future engineer instead of a corporate liability. I listened to my daughter speak and felt an overwhelming sense of validation wash over me. The 15 years of sacrifice, the long, exhausting hours of specialized tutoring, the tight budgets, and the quiet, invisible struggles were all entirely worth it. I had not just raised a highly successful woman, I had raised a profoundly good woman. A woman with an unbreakable moral compass, who understood that wealth was merely a tool, not an identity. You taught me that, Mom, Leah said, turning her gaze back to me. Her eyes were bright and clear, but there were no melodramatic tears falling down her cheeks. We were two Black women who understood the hard, unforgiving realities of the world, and we did not need to cry to express the immense depth of our mutual respect. Our bond was forged in the fire of perseverance. You taught me that family is not about biological convenience or shared genetics, Leah said, her words landing with quiet, heavy significance. Family is a verb. It is an action. It is showing up every single day, even when it is incredibly hard and you are completely exhausted. She leaned forward, maintaining strong eye contact. Vivian thought she could just walk into a restaurant and purchase the title of mother with a piece of expensive real estate. But you earned that title by sitting on the floor with me when I was having severe panic attacks about going to school. You earned it by fighting aggressively with the school board administrators to get me the educational accommodations I desperately needed. You earned it by working overtime audits just to pay for my college application fees and my textbooks. You are my mother, Gwendolyn. You are my only family, and you are the absolute only reason I am sitting in this comfortable chair today. I looked at my daughter, accepting the profound weight and truth of her words. We did not need to hug or sob to validate the reality of our relationship. The respect between us was a tangible, solid thing built on a foundation of absolute, unwavering trust. You are sitting in that chair because of your own brilliant mind. Leah, I replied, my voice filled with quiet, unshakable conviction. I just gave you the safe, supportive space you needed to figure out how to use it. You took the modest tools I provided, and you built an empire that is going to change the world for the better. You did the heavy lifting, sweetheart. I just made sure the foundation was secure. We sat in the sunlit office for another hour, going over the detailed financial reports for the foundation. We discussed the operational budget, the new aggressive hiring initiatives for the specialized teaching staff, and the long-term sustainability of the community grant programs. It was a conversation between two seasoned professionals, two women who had stared down the absolute darkest aspects of corporate greed and emerged completely victorious. There was no lingering trauma from the brutal confrontation at the Capitol Grill. The people who had tried to destroy us were nothing more than cautionary tales, now pathetic footnotes in the history of our success. Colin and Tara were trapped in their self-inflicted poverty, learning the hard way that social climbing without a safety rope always leads to a broken neck. Vivian Davenport was a disgraced former executive facing a lengthy stint in federal prison, her fake legacy completely erased from the corporate landscape of the city. They had all severely underestimated us. They had looked at a quiet, practical auditor and a dyslexic girl and thought we were easy, gullible prey. They did not understand that the quietest people in the room are usually the ones observing every single detail, learning the layout of the maze, and calculating the exact perfect path to the exit. I closed the financial portfolio and placed it back into my leather briefcase. The numbers are perfectly balanced. Leah, I said, snapping the brass latches of the briefcase shut. Your operational runway is entirely secured for the next 10 years. This educational foundation is going to outlive us both. That is the whole point, Leah said, smiling that same confident, unbothered smile that she had worn when she crossed out Vivian's deceptive contract. We are going to make sure that no one ever gets left behind at a bus stop again. We are going to find every discarded genius in this city, and we are going to give them the exact tools they need to conquer the world. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair, feeling a deep, profound sense of completion settling in my bones. The painful narrative of the abandoned child and the struggling auditor was officially retired, permanently written out of our lives. We were the sole architects of our own future now, and the beautiful, empowering foundation we had built was absolutely indestructible. I walked toward the door of the office, pausing for just a moment to look back at the brilliant self-made billionaire who was already turning her attention back to the grant applications on her desk. I will see you for dinner tonight, I said, opening the door. Leah did not look up, but her smile widened into something incredibly warm and purely joyful. I am making lasagna, Mom, she replied, her voice floating across the bright, spacious room. Do not be late. I walked out of the office and down the sunlit hallway of the foundation, leaving my daughter to run her empire exactly the way she saw fit. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta loomed against the pale winter sky, an imposing structure of cold white marble and reinforced glass. It was late January, exactly 8 months after the spectacular implosion of Davenport Global at the Capitol Grill. The biting wind whipped through the city streets, but I felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of closure warming my chest. I sat on the solid wooden bench outside courtroom 4, wearing a simple tailored charcoal suit, clutching a thick manila folder that contained the final forensic audit report. The Securities and Exchange Commission had requested my presence today, not just as the lead federal investigator, but as their primary expert witness for the sentencing phase of the trial. Leah sat quietly beside me, her posture perfectly aligned, radiating the exact same unbothered tranquility she carried every single day. She wore a modest black dress, her hair styled in elegant, neat braids, completely indifferent to the massive swarm of aggressive reporters waiting outside the courthouse doors. The media had been obsessed with this case for months, running endless segments on the sudden catastrophic collapse of Atlanta's most famous logistics billionaire. But Leah never gave them a single interview. She let her phenomenal success at Apex Logistics Solutions speak for itself, while Vivian's fake empire was dismantled brick by brick in the federal courts. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom finally swung open and a uniformed bailiff signaled for us to enter. The gallery was packed with journalists, former Davenport Global shareholders, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness the final act of the corporate tragedy. Leah and I walked down the center aisle, our footsteps silent on the carpet, ignoring the thousands of eyes tracking our every move. We took our seats in the second row directly behind the prosecution table. I looked toward the defense table and saw the hollow remains of a woman who used to believe she owned the world. Vivian Davenport sat slumped in a heavy oak chair. The untouchable billionaire logistics queen was completely gone. The woman sitting mere feet away from me wore a standard-issue federal detention jumpsuit, the dull fabric hanging loosely on her diminishing frame. Her expensive designer highlights had long since grown out into dull gray roots, and her face was heavily lined with exhaustion and bitter defeat. The pristine white blazer she wore on the night she tried to steal my daughter's future was now nothing more than a distant, pathetic memory. The federal judge, a stern, serious man with decades of complex corporate fraud cases under his belt, called the court to order, his gavel echoing sharply across the large room. The prosecution laid out the final sentencing recommendations, based entirely on the mathematical autopsy I had methodically conducted over the past several months. The prosecutor's words were clinical and merciless, painting a vivid, undeniable picture of a CEO who had systematically looted her own company to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. When my name was called, I stood up from the gallery bench and walked steadily toward the witness box. The bailiff swore me in and I took my seat, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease. The lead prosecutor approached the podium asking me to summarize the financial devastation I had uncovered during my exhaustive federal audit. I spoke clearly and methodically, leaving absolutely no room for emotional manipulation or clever legal loopholes. I did not raise my voice or display any personal animosity toward the broken woman sitting at the defense table. I let the cold, hard data do all the heavy lifting. I detailed the intricate web of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and the millions of dollars in embezzled shareholder dividends. I broke down the exact timeline of the fraudulent supply chain metrics Vivian had used to artificially inflate her company stock. And finally, I laid out the explicit paper trail proving her desperate attempt to launder stolen corporate funds through the rapid purchase of luxury real estate, specifically a $25 million mansion in Buckhead. I explained how she had planned to use a fraudulent family trust agreement to steal valuable artificial intelligence technology from a young college graduate in a last-ditch effort to save her insolvent company from a massive federal environmental fine. Vivian's defense attorneys did not even bother to cross-examine me. There was nothing they could say to refute the absolute mountain of verified bank records and internal communications I had provided to the court. The numbers were entirely bulletproof. Vivian stared down at her chained hands, her shoulders shaking slightly as every single one of her elaborate lies was publicly dragged into the light and destroyed. After the closing arguments, the judge looked down from his high bench, fixing Vivian with an expression of profound disgust. He delivered a scathing reprimand that would echo in the Atlanta business community for decades. He called her actions a textbook example of unbridled predatory greed, masking itself as visionary leadership. He stated that her willingness to exploit her own biological daughter for corporate gain was one of the most morally bankrupt maneuvers he had ever witnessed in his entire career on the bench. He did not show a single ounce of mercy. He sentenced Vivian Davenport to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. Furthermore, he ordered the complete liquidation of all her remaining personal assets, to pay the massive Department of Transportation fines, and to compensate the thousands of employees who had lost their pensions when her fraudulent empire collapsed. The Buckhead mansion, the luxury vehicles, the offshore accounts, everything was permanently seized by the United States government. The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the sounding block was incredibly final. The trial was officially over. As the federal marshals moved in to pull Vivian up from her chair and place the heavy steel handcuffs on her wrists, she suddenly turned around, her desperate eyes scanning the gallery until they locked directly onto Leah. Vivian's face twisted into a pathetic, grotesque mask of pure hatred combined with bottomless despair. She strained against the marshal's grips, her mouth opening as if she wanted to scream one last terrible curse at the daughter who had outsmarted her. She wanted Leah to flinch, to cry, to show some tiny sign of emotional damage or lingering attachment. She wanted to know that she had at least left a scar. But Leah gave her absolutely nothing. My beautiful, brilliant daughter sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She did not look away, and she did not smile. Leah just stared back at the convicted felon with cold, unbothered indifference, as if she were looking at a complete stranger who had simply bumped into her on a crowded sidewalk and moved on. There was no anger in Leah's eyes because anger requires a person to actually care. Vivian was no longer a threat, a mother, or even a memory. She was just a cautionary tale wearing a federal jumpsuit. Vivian let out a choked, broken sob as she finally realized the absolute totality of her defeat. She had not just lost her company and her freedom, she had completely erased herself from the only legacy that actually mattered. The marshals pulled her roughly by the arms, leading her through the side door of the courtroom and into the holding cells. She disappeared from our view, permanently swallowed up by the federal justice system she had thought she was too rich to ever face. We stood up from the wooden benches as the gallery began to clear out. I looked at Leah and she gave me a small, quiet nod. We turned and walked up the center aisle together, our footsteps steady and synchronized. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, letting them close behind us with a loud, definitive thud that sealed Vivian's fate and closed that dark chapter of our lives forever. We navigated the busy marble hallways of the courthouse, bypassing the main entrance, where the screaming reporters and flashing camera lenses were waiting for a sensational quote. We took the secure employee exit down to the underground parking garage, moving through the quiet concrete structure until we reached my reliable 5-year-old Honda Accord. It was parked neatly between two expensive luxury sedans, looking wonderfully modest and entirely debt-free. The air down in the garage was cool and incredibly clean. We got into the car, the familiar engine turning over smoothly the moment I turned the key in the ignition. The soft hum of the heater filled the small enclosed space, wrapping us in a familiar, comfortable warmth. Leah reached across the center console and placed her hand gently over mine. I looked at my daughter, seeing the absolute freedom radiating from her bright, clear eyes. There were no more battles to fight, no more toxic relatives to avoid, and no more ghosts hiding in the shadows of our success. We had faced the absolute worst aspects of elite wealth and corporate cruelty, and we had walked away completely untouched with our integrity and our empire firmly intact. I shifted the car into drive. We pulled out of the parking spot, rolling up the concrete ramp and merging seamlessly into the bright, busy flow of the Atlanta afternoon traffic, leaving the courthouse and the dark past behind us forever. The ultimate lesson from Gwen and Leah's journey is that true family is defined by consistent actions, not biological convenience or a massive price tag. Wealth and elite status are fragile illusions when built on a foundation of greed, exploitation, and betrayal. Real power comes from intellectual independence, unwavering integrity, and the quiet resilience to build your own table when others try to deny you a seat. Leah's success proves that your worth is never determined by those who abandon you, but by the brilliant future you choose to build for yourself. Never trade your authenticity for toxic approval. Share your own stories of overcoming toxic environments and building your success in the comments below. And hit that like and subscribe button for more empowering journeys.